Good morning. Welcome to Sunday Morning Devotional brought to you by Golden Isles Primitive Baptist Fellowship. I'm Vernon Eckleberry, and momentarily I'll bring you a lesson entitled John Bunyan and the Pilgrim's Progress Part 1. But first, here's Cecile Karen McGuire, one of our accompanists for the Primitive Baptist Music Workshop Choir, playing Hold Thou My Hand. Thank you, Cecile. What a wonderful way to begin our devotional this morning. John Bunyan and the Pilgrim's Progress Part 1. And we're labeling this part the influence of books, the influence of books. John Bunyan was born in 1628. He was an English writer and Puritan preacher who's best remembered as the author of the Christian allegory, the Pilgrim's Progress. English poet William Cowper commemorates John Bunyan in his poem Tiresinia with the following lines: "Ingenious dreamer in whose well-told tale sweet fiction and sweet truth alike prevail, whose humorous vein, strong sense, and simple style may reach the gayest and make the gravest smile. Witty and well employed, and like the Lord, speaking in parables his slighted word. I name thee not, lest so despised a name should move a sneer at thy deserved fame." More to say about that later. "Yet in transitory life's late day, that mingles all my brown with sober gray, revere the name, whose pilgrim marks the road, and guides the progress of the soul to God." So we began the influence of books with John Bunyan in the Bedford jail. After his somewhat troubled youth, Bunyan joined the Pilgrim Free Church in Bedford, England, and he began preaching in 1657. But under the reign of King Charles II, nonconformist preachers, considered to be an affront to the Church of England, were subject to arrest and imprisonment. Bunyan refused to refrain from preaching to his little flock in Bedford, and the authorities arrested him in 1660. In January of 1661, the magistrates remanded Bunyan at the age of 32 to the Bedford jail, where he would spend the next 12 years of his life. Now let's look at the Pilgrim's Progress. William Cowper's label for Bunyan, the ingenious dreamer, derives from the fact that Bunyan often had dreams that inspired his writing. It's little wonder that the Pilgrim's Progress, written during his imprisonment, presents itself as a dream narrative. As a matter of fact, it begins this way: "As I walked through the wilderness of this world, I lighted on a certain place where was a den, and I laid me down in that place to sleep. And as I slept, I dreamed a dream." That's the way it begins. And so the Pilgrim's Progress follows the journey of a man named Christian. And he travels from his home, which is called the City of Destruction, to the celestial city, the city of God. The story allegorically represents a believer's walk of faith and its attendant struggles. Christian meets one obstacle after another, and several times the success of his pilgrimage is in doubt. If the story were a movie, it would fall into the road trip genre. It's generally accepted that the adventures of Christian, the pilgrim in Pilgrim's Progress, represent Bunyan's own adventure of faith from worldliness to the kingdom of God, as it's set down in his book Grace Abounding, which is sort of an autobiography of his journey of faith. Many of the experiences Bunyan records in this work, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners, resemble the character Pilgrim in the Pilgrim's Progress. Grace Abounding concerns John Bunyan's spiritual transformation from his rough early years to maturity in the faith. He writes in the preface, "In this discourse of mine you may see much, I say, of the grace of God towards me." Grace Abounding reveals several events that stand out as contributing to the success of Bunyan's pilgrim journey. And I've extracted some of these influences set down in Grace Abounding that might be useful to all who embark on the adventure of faith. Hopefully, you'll find help and encouragement for your own spiritual growth. I'll focus on each one separately over the next few weeks, choosing them according to topic rather than in chronological order, beginning with the influence of books. So let's then look at the influence of books. John Bunyan carried 2 books with him to the Bedford jail, the Holy Bible and Fox's Book of Martyrs, and he also carried some writing material. These were the only resources at his disposal during his confinement in that cold, dark, damp, and overcrowded prison. The 2 books would prove enough, however, for writing Grace Abounding and much of Pilgrim's Progress, along with several tracts that he was able perhaps to make a little money off of in order to help his family back in Bedford. Bunyan's spiritual pilgrimage probably began under the influence of 2 other books. He had little, if any, religious stimulation during his early years. But when he married a pious young woman, whose name is unknown to this day, her dowry consisted of only 2 possessions, seemingly of little worth. Here's Bunyan's remembrance in Grace Abounding. This woman and I, though we came together as poor as might be, not having so much household stuff as a dish or a spoon betwixt us, yet this she had for her part, the plain man's pathway to heaven and the practice of piety, which her father had left her when he died. In these 2 books I should sometimes read with her, wherein I also found some things that were pleasing to me. But all this while I met with no conviction. The 2 books, of course, fell short of converting Bunyan, but they induced thoughts about things formerly lacking in his life. Later he writes in Grace Abounding about the growing influence of the printed word, and these books in particular. He writes, "Wherefore these books, though they did not reach my heart to awaken it about my sad and sinful state, yet they did beget within me some desires to religion. So that because I knew no better, I fell in very eagerly with the religion of the times." The books began something. This experience corresponds to the beginning of the main character in Pilgrim's Progress. Listen to the dreamer's account of how a book arouses Christians' thoughts toward spiritual matters. "I dreamed a dream, and behold, I saw a man clothed with rags standing in a certain place with his face from his own house, a book in his hand, and a great burden upon his back. I looked and saw him open the book and read therein, and as he read, he wept and trembled, and not being able longer to contain it, he brake out with a lamentable cry, saying, 'What shall I do?'" The book in Christian's hand, of course, was the Holy Bible. The words of the Scriptures permeate and seize control of Pilgrim's mind and his heart and soul, and drive him to consider more, to discover more. In this manner, books progressively induced Bunyan's development from unbelief to discipleship. But always the Holy Bible stood preeminent among the influential resources. His collection of books grew as his meager fare allowed. He writes, "I do prefer this book of Martin Luther upon Galatians, excepting the Holy Bible, before all the books that ever I have seen, as most fit for a wounded conscience." So let's think for a moment about the gift of books. the world might well have been deprived of the writings of John Bunyan, and particularly the Pilgrim's Progress, if not for several influences in his early life. The impact of books ranks high among those influences. I received a little volume as a gift from my grandmother Jance on my 7th birthday, and it's entitled God's 10 Rules. It consists of stories based on God's commandments, stories that a child could understand. I've never forgotten the lessons that this book contains. They've stayed with me all my life. For another birthday, the same grandmother gave me Uncle Arthur's bedtime stories. It's a collection of delightful, heartwarming stories, each teaching a spiritual lesson. I've used these stories, as I recall them, for illustrations in sermons many, many times. As a matter of fact, I have my favorite story always marked. It's called Jesus Understood. Neither of these books converted me to through the Christian faith, but as with Bunyan, reading them awakened something that later, many years later, grew into Christian discipleship. We give presents of all descriptions to our loved ones, young and old. Most of these gifts fall into disuse after a short period of time or become hidden among other material things. On the other hand, the gift of a book not only lasts, but may well have a profound effect on the recipient. Let me recommend 3 resources that will assist you as you set out on your pilgrimage to spiritual discovery. These are, of course, recommended in addition to the King James Version of the Holy Bible. Firstly, I recommend Zondervan's Pictorial Bible Dictionary. Secondly, the New Strong's Concise Concordance of the Bible. And then thirdly, Matthew Henry's Bible Commentary in 1 volume. I also highly recommend the edition of Pilgrim's Progress in modern English. It has more than 100 original illustrations, and impactful Bible verses are tied to each scene in the book. This is the edition published by Anico Press. The marketplace abounds with material trinkets that please the eye, but only spiritual books feed the soul. May your spiritual pilgrimage begin and continue like Bunyan's character Christian, who from the outset was found with a book in his hand. Until next Sunday, may God be with you till we meet again. Till we meet